with a debate on the Anthropocene and global climate politics. This will be followed by a session on social inequalities and political exclusion on November 2. The network conference will conclude on November 8 with a session on the possibilities and limits of intercultural dialogue, which will also address questions of the geopolitics of power in the academic field. This conference takes place virtually at Bielefeld University, and at Bielefeld University, no other person is more qualified to give these greetings now than Angelika Epple. As Vice Rector for Research and as former Vice Rector for International Affairs and Diversity, as well as initiator and spokespersons of large research networks such as the Collaborative Research Center 1288, and as a theoretical pioneer of a microhistory of global entanglements, Angelika is predestined for this greeting. So you have the word, Angelika.
Muchas gracias por las bonitas palabras de presentación, querido Olaf.
Thank you very much for your wonderful welcoming remarks, dear Olaf.
And for organizing this series of events, which is being held online due to the pandemic. So thank you very much, Olaf. We have learned in this time that online is the new normal and that we have been able to intensify our global networking and virtual exchange with international partners thanks to the digitalization push, even though we all miss physical meetings very much. As Vice Rector for Research and International Affairs, I'm happy to take the floor on behalf of our Rector, Professor Dr. Gerhard Zagerer, who is unfortunately prevented from speaking and assisting to the special event today. So now comes the official part. Dear Mrs. Norwig, dear Mr. Haag, dear representatives of the Merian centers, Hamburg Hanseatic colleges and regional studies projects, dear panelists, dear streaming viewers, dear colleagues and friends of CALAS. I would like to welcome you today to the first network meeting of the Merian Centers Hamburg Hanseatic colleges and regional study projects, hosted by the Center for Advanced Latin American Studies, commonly known as CALAS. Our Rector, who follows with great interest the projects funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and especially the activities of CALAS, would have liked so much to be here himself today. He still fondly remembers his visit to the Universidad de Guadalajara, UDG, in Mexico roughly 3 years ago, when an international CALAS Congress was held at the University Center of Social Sciences and Humanities. Then we also extended our cooperation agreement with UDG for the third time and signed both a brand new double degree agreement combining our Master Inter-American Studies with Maestria in Literaturas Interamericanas, and most importantly, we also signed a strategic partnership statement. I myself have very fond memories of this eventful visit as well, and I hope that we will soon be able to hold another meeting in presence all together, be it in Latin America or in Europe or the United States. Mutual visits create special moments and shared memories and experiences that allow partnerships to grow. Bielefeld University is very proud of its long-lasting cooperation history with the UDG, and that goes back to 2003 and was consolidated with a general agreement only 2 years later. Since 2007, the International Study Partnership Program funded by the German Academic Exchange Service supported the mobility students and teachers. Since that time, also many joint research projects, common conferences and summer schools took place regularly. However, the highlight, and in a way also one outcome of our cooperation, was certainly the foundation of the Sibylla Merian Center for Advanced Latin American Studies in March 2017. It has been funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research within probably the most voluminous and sustainable call for tender for Latin American studies in Germany of all time. And I would like to also highlight that the universities of Kassel, Hanover and Jena, as well as the Universidad de Costa Rica, the Flasco in Quito, and the Universidad Nacional San Martín are also involved in the cooperation, with Bielefeld and Guadalajara being the lead institutions. The CALAS, with its consortium of 8 universities from Latin America and from Germany, as well as its great number of associate universities and institutes in other Latin American countries, might serve to extend the already existing context into a multilateral network in the Americas and in Europe. Today's event is a kick-off of an international conference which is dedicated to the topic at the cutting edges of knowledge production, borders, and black holes in academic dialogue. It delivers the ideal basis not only for scientific exchange, but also for networking within the projects funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. It provides the framework for 4 thematic slots, starting today with the challenges of the Anthropocene, dialogue with the non-human world. A panel which is rounded off by an interregional dialogue today starting at 6 o'clock. Subsequent conferences or meetings will focus on other interesting thematic areas such as social inequalities and political exclusion and intercultural dialogues. With this nice foretaste of the series of events in mind, I wish us all, also on behalf of the Rector of Bielefeld University, a great international conference with exciting discussions around the theme, the challenges of the Anthropocene. I would like to thank you for your attention and hand over to Ms. Christina Norwig from the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I have the pleasure to say a few introductory words now on behalf of the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. So, dear Professor Epple, dear Professor Kaltmeier, and members of the organizing team, distinguished panelists and participants, dear ladies and gentlemen. Modern society is facing diverse and multiple challenges: globalization, technological changes, digital transformation, migration, as well as the demographic and climate change, just to name a few. The humanities and social sciences play a key role in overcoming these challenges. They analyze the developments and systems in society and provide orientational and practical knowledge about society. The Federal Ministry of Education and Research, short BMBF, therefore supports research in the humanities and the social sciences through various funding programs. We provide about 700 million euros for projects under our framework program, Understanding Society, Shaping the Future, in the period of 2019 to 2025. The program provides opportunities for researchers and scope for research into new subject areas and the establishment of powerful research data infrastructures. In this way, the humanities and social sciences have the means to improve our understanding of societal developments, support and drive social innovation, and help open up and preserve our cultural heritage, and thus reconcile social diversity and cohesion. So this is the framework in which we are currently operating. I would like to briefly highlight 2 aspects of this major program. One aspect is the creation of opportunities or scope for scientific experiments, and the other aspect is internationalization. These are the aspects that have brought us together today. The BMBF started collaborating with the Hamburger International Centers back in 2007 to develop a research format for new and innovative research questions. The aim was to enable research on topics chosen by the researchers themselves that would bring together international and national scientists. These opportunities for conducting independent research were met with great enthusiasm. 14 universities have set up Hamburger International Centers in the meantime. By establishing the Sibylla Merian centers set up in India, Mexico and Brazil, Ghana and Tunisia since 2015, the idea of cooperation in specific partner countries and regions became reality. The Merian centers offer intercultural insights, helping us to better understand societal developments and to find potential solutions for challenges facing society. These activities build on the experience gained in the course of the area studies. The BMBF has been funding these studies for many years in order to generate more insight into the links between societies around the world, be it at the political, economic, cultural, societal, religious, or digital level. Thanks to this knowledge and the international interdisciplinarity collaboration with regional and thematic focuses, the area studies promote a better understanding of current and historical developments. So on behalf of the BMBF, we would like to thank you very much for your valuable work in the research projects in the humanities and social sciences under all these three funding lines. These funding lines have so many things in common. For example, some of you conduct research on similar topics under similar structural conditions. This prompted us to think about how we can support networking between the funding lines. We have therefore developed a META project with a number of objectives. We aim to work together with you to advance the internationalization of humanities, learn from your experience, and gain ideas for new funding initiatives. We aim to promote the transfer of research findings into communities and society as a whole, and we aim to offer you opportunities for exchange and networking. These are two among many objectives. We at the BMBF, of course, hope to gain more insight into the opportunities and challenges encountered during the projects. This will help us to design future measures that are tailored to your specific needs. The META project will focus on three major lines. We aim to increase the visibility of research in the humanities and social sciences and raise awareness among policymakers and in society. This is why we are providing funding for 1 or 2 science festivals per year. The Border Crossing Solidarities Festival, organized by Leipzig University, was already held virtually in summer. Next summer, it will be organized as a live event again. You can access the documentation of the Globe Festival online under globefestival.de. The program that Leipzig University put together is truly impressive. The Käthe Hamburger International Center at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg is currently holding a science festival as well, the 2021 Humanities Festival. From 15th to the 25th of October, the center is hosting a conference, several workshops and talks, as well as a number of cultural events, which focus on societal and political dimensions in the past, present, and future. The event will be live streamed, so please consider following along. So science festivals are the first major part, or first major line that we are addressing with the META projects. The festivals are intended to increase the public awareness of the contribution of the humanities to understanding societal developments. In contrast, the network meetings, as just as today, serve to facilitate the exchange and expertise between our three funding lines: the Käthe Hamburger International Centers, the Maria Sibylla Merian Centers, and the area studies. This is why the networking meeting is the second line of our META project. And we would like to thank the organizers in Bielefeld very much for hosting this very first online event and giving us the opportunity for more intensive dialogue. We aim to strengthen this dialogue even more in the longer term. So today's meeting will be followed by further meetings over the coming years. So you can all apply by submitting the expression of interest form, which you have already received. funds will be provided by an increase in basic funding. We are also eager to hear good ideas from your part for the future network meetings. So we are still missing the third line of the meetup project, and this is a call for a supporting research project. In addition to its own science studies activities, the project should deliver specific suggestions based on monitoring and analysis of research in the humanities and social sciences. This project will thus help us to learn even more about the international research landscape and its challenges. It also serves our goal of intensifying our dialogue with the scientific community so that we are able to plan the further development of our funding programs. So let me now conclude by coming back to what has brought us together today. Today's meeting is a bit different as we had originally planned it. The opportunities given by the digital format are limited. Unfortunately, we cannot use the coffee breaks for an informal exchange, and this has already been mentioned before. However, it will still be interesting to hear the inputs and discussions. Furthermore, we are able to include scientists and participants who otherwise would not have been able to participate in person. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you many inspiring discussions, and I wish the organizers every success for the event. And I hope we will see each other again on the 9th of November, when we will focus on science communication. We have prepared a very interesting program and hope that it will provide you with many ideas and stimulate lively discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina Norwig, for these exciting insights into the innovative and international, especially international research strategy of the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And now we will jump directly into the challenges of the Anthropocene. And I hand over to the moderation to Angelika Epple, and wish us all a stimulating and provoking and intensive exchange of ideas. So, Angelika, you have the word.
Thanks again, Olaf, for handing over. And when you asked me if I would be able to moderate the challenges of the Anthropocene, a dialogue with the non-human world, I immediately accepted, and this for many reasons. I mean, of course, we all are really concerned with the challenges of the Anthropocene. So, I mean, this stands for itself and doesn't need any reason why we should deal with it. But what I really found so interesting is the second part of the title of today's panel, the dialogue with the non-human world. I mean, some of you might be curious how the non-human world would answer today, or if it's just a dialogue in just one direction. But as a historian, I would say that the non-human world is already answering for centuries. However, its language might not be working with words, but differently. So today, I think we are going to get insights from different disciplinary backgrounds into the question, how are the contemporary challenges disrupted or accompanied by a disruption of the past and the future? How do climate change adaptation practices in rural Ghana work? And how are the challenges for historians in a more than human world? And I'm really happy to welcome today in the first panel 3 renowned scholars. Professor Dr. Jörn Ahrens from University of Gießen, Professor Dr. Charlotte Ridley Asante from the University of Ghana, and Professor Dr. Christoph Mauch from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. And then in the second part of this panel, we will have two more quite renowned scholars who are already with us, Deepesh Chakrabarti and Franz Maulshagen. I would now suggest that I first introduce the speaker, and then she or he have like 20 minutes or so to give an input, and then would come the next speaker. We get another 20 minutes input, and then the third speaker, and then we have a joint discussion on the topics of the first part of our panel. So let me please first introduce Professor Dr. Jörn Ahrens. He's professor of cultural sociology with emphasis on the transformation of cultures at the Justus Liebig University of Gießen in Germany. There he participates in the collaborative research project, The Social Impacts of Climate Change and Sustainability Innovation in the Global South. And what is interesting, that he also brings in expertise from his position as extraordinary professor of social anthropology at the Northwest University in South Africa. He's an expert in media, popular media and cultures, with an emphasis on comics and movies. His academic work focuses on the study of society, fear, and violence. In addition, he also explores the relations between nature and culture and the questions on the self and the myth. His last monograph was published in 2019 and is named, in English, Overdrawn Spectacles, Production of Violence in Comics. This year, he edited the two following books, and this is all what I want to mention, just to make all the all people curious about going deeper into what you've been done already. The two following books, The Social and Cultural Dimension of Climate Change in Sub-Saharan Africa, and Politics of the Frontier, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on the Frontier in the Contemporary Western. Dear Professor Ahrens, the Anthropocene as Third Nature, Contemporary Challenges and the Disruption of Past and Future. That's the title of your paper. The floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks for the kind introduction, and I'm very happy to have the chance to participate in the conference. Have I shared my screen successfully? I guess so. So now, okay, so I will briefly reflect on three subjects. First nature, then the future, and at the very least, very briefly, the non-human. Okay, and oh, this is of course last foil. So let's start now. Okay, today it is largely undisputed that the concept of the Anthropocene as a new epoch in the history of Earth results from a profound ecological diagnosis. By now, the impact of the human species has been so deep that its consequences ultimately call for an understanding of the human being as geological force. Part of this global, or maybe more correct, planetary crisis are phenomena like climate change, today perceived as the most urgent global crisis topic, economic extractivism, habitat destruction, etc., etc. In all these cases, ecological problems are evolving into crisis patterns that are targeting global self-preservation not only of the human species, but of Earth as rhizomatic structure of interactions and interdependencies. And with this consideration of nature as a medium of crisis, the question emerges which understanding of nature would be appropriate to approach such challenges, and how non-human entities or non-human actors were to be considered within processes of mitigation, adaptation, or even prevention. What is also becoming evident is the fact that long before the notion of the Anthropocene emerged as substantial concept, the human species did establish as geological force. Thus, the Anthropocene does not constitute the human being as geological force. Only in the Anthropocene, this fact has become undeniable. In fact, the Anthropocene is only the result of previous processes in history which have been culminating in the second half of the 20th century and in early 21st century, but which have been at latest initialized with the beginnings of the industrialization. In fact, the Anthropocene results from what Marx has called the metabolism of nature, Stoffwechsel mit der Natur, as via the basic activity of labor, man is in constant interaction with nature, which he or she is cultivating, transforming, and extracting. The gestalt of nature changes substantially during the course of such comprehensive exploitation. Nature is seen by Marx primarily as a resource that provides the basis for human existence and production. As such, it does not come without precondition, but demands interaction, for which Marx finds the metaphor of metabolism. Speaking about nature, there's not only the relation between the human species and nature that needs to be reflected in new and appropriate ways. Here, various approaches have been employed in recent years that seek to understand nature not anymore as material object and resource for the benefit of man, but as counterpart within a network of interrelated actors of different kinds. Ursula Heise, Philippe de Coulard, Bruno Latour, to mention only a few, have contributed to these questions. From this basis draws the question, which nature it is with which the world is confronted in the Anthropocene. If the assumption of a pristine nature is seen as an illusion, as nature is always a concept that derives from cultural assumptions and relations, this kind of first nature functions as fictional ideal of a world that is characterized by the absence of human action. Philosophical anthropology has invented the notion of a second nature that aims at the artificial environment that humans do create and that also constitutes the realm of culture in which humans live. Culture itself is, in this sense, regarded as second nature, as it provides the essential environment in which human life is only possible. Even nature itself, while being modified during the process of metabolism, is thus genuine part of second nature, as it has been made manageable for humane needs. It is under this framing that a third kind of nature emerges, and this is a sort of nature that results from human-driven processes directed at nature that transform nature in as radical as unpredictable ways. This contemporary type of nature that emerges from processes of human-based interference, alteration, and transformation needs to be addressed as third nature. A nature that, especially as existential threat, has become radically anthropogenic in that sense that it has been consequently created and determined by anthropogenic purposes and action. On the one hand, it is the characteristic of classic industrial modernity to leave no such nature that would not be overwritten by association. Thus, one could say the modern state of a domination of nature was following the logic of colonialist power. Nature, as second nature, is a colonized entity. A third nature is turned to an abject and monstrous nature when, at the peak of modern industrialized societies, a segment of techno-associated nature separates from such domination of nature by merging with anthropogenic technology. This said, the domination of nature through industrialization and technology and its effect on the production of techno-wise informed nature results in a paradoxical situation. because in the effect, it is exactly this sort of a technologically modified and associated nature that turns into an element of sustainable disruption, maybe even destruction of such association. It is especially the paradigmatic phenomena of the Anthropocene, like climate change, that cannot be understood as natural nature, but as products of technologically affected forms of nature that can only emerge under the condition of a complete association and technification of nature. In this sense, third nature transforms into a thought of anthropomorphic nature that takes monstrous shape. As such, it separates from an anthropogenic second nature produced by association and culturalization. This monstrously associated nature confronts anthropogenic society as discord, failure, and especially as genuine other. This nature represents a type of nature that has been anthropogenically initialized, but that has also so far detached from its anthropogenic basics that it now becomes the radical opponent of an anthropogenic society. The Anthropocene transforms second nature into third nature that clearly bears an anthropogenic indexicality. In the present, it has therefore become difficult to say anything, and especially nature could be defined as non-human. Such sort of new nature that is no longer integrated into the procedures of association has become essentially dangerous and consequently affects its original creators when it challenges various livelihoods of mankind. So what we see today is an anthropogenic nature that, as postmodern monstrous nature again emerges as ultimate, abject, and a generator of fear. Third nature today is that which is threatening planetary integrity just because it is affected by humane influence and dissociated from it at once. Anthropogenic climate change thus needs to be understood as anthropogenically motivated transformation of nature. Such nature is the absolute other to a culturally coded nature of mankind. The metabolism of nature, one could say, produces monstrosities. So, future. The second question to address is the time horizon to which the Anthropocene as concept applies. Remarkably, the Anthropocene is not only characterized by the human species as geological force that is altering the understanding and representation of nature. Additionally, in the Anthropocene, the human species is also altering the understanding of world time by a so far unknown narrowing of the time horizon that is disposable for social and political acting, and therefore a substantial loss of future. Politics in the Anthropocene always are politics against the background of an eclipse of future. This shutdown of the future, accelerated by many of the ecological crises that constitute the particular condition of the Anthropocene and massively articulated by social movements like Fridays for Future, is literally subverting and decomposing the overall understanding of a future-related time in modernity. Modern societies are characterized by the consequent orientation towards the future as a state which has not been realized yet and is thus unknown. This expectation of the future is one of the core elements of modernity. By means of prognosis, Reinhard Koselleck says, time could be produced that would determine the future. What is special in modern societies, following Koselleck, is that by means of prognosis, they have colonized the future as de facto unavailable time as a field of finite possibilities, which is organized in levels of greater and smaller probability. It is therefore not in the interest of modern societies to fully unveil the definite process of coming history, but to derive from the future options for an at least partially calculable predictability of the future. That way, in modernity, the future is opening up for formability by social action. By such integration of the future into the present social state, by practices of calculation, a reality that has not realized yet is permanently held in anticipation. Future is a core category of a modernity whose self-understanding foremost derives from this future, and that regards its options as open horizon of that which is ahead in time. Without such focus on future, the modern idea of progress, for instance, would have been impossible. Following Koselleck, two elements are essentially. Firstly, the temporal acceleration by which future realizes itself as presence. And secondly, its unfamiliarity, as the accelerated time, which is our history, reduces the possibilities for experience. However, it is not possible to anticipate the future as it remains incalculable and always at risk. Future highlights the gestalt of social reality, but in still unfamiliar form. Even if the future can be anticipated via imagination or prognosis, it is not possible to really experience it. The anticipation of future always remains speculation and fictitious. But what is happening in the Anthropocene is the total revision of the association of the future as predominant concept of modernity. In the wake of ever-increasing ecological crisis plus an ongoing improvement of scientific capabilities, the future definitely seems not to be enigmatic anymore. Today, climatologists are able to calculate the future warming of the Earth as only one but prominent example by astonishing accuracy. On meta scale, the question of how the Earth, how our society will look like in the future has become rather obvious. And the accessibility of such future has also become an important rhetorical tool in public discourse. Remarkably, these scenarios of a highly predictable future do vastly communicate in negative perception of the future when they connect to a clearly dystopian understanding of future. This means that in the age of the Anthropocene, by the medium of a third nature, the concept of future transforms from an open horizon as an area for risk assessment, calculation, and unsecured agency to a rather foreseeable pattern of negative development that does not leave much room for change or individual flexibility. When in classic modernity, the risky subject was everything that became successful and heroic by entering the unknown territory of the future, to cultivate it by its individual ideas, the virtue of the subject in the Anthropocene is absolutely not to cultivate the future, but to leave the remaining capacities of more or less non-human entities as unharmed as possible. Open horizon of the future is constantly constricted, as the predicted future is unfolding rather deterministic and in ways that leave no room for intervention or alteration. Accordingly, an important rhetorical gesture in contemporary politics and social movements emphasizes the closure of the future as a window that allows to take influence on future development. The future of the contemporary, it seems, that defines the presence of the Anthropocene has been fully determined by actions in the past, not only but foremost by industrialized nations. So now it is about the non-human. Very briefly, to summarize, the Anthropocene does not only recognize the human species as geological force, or to be more precise, as most decisive geological force. In its wake, also a new type of nature emerges that I have termed third nature, a nature that is highly anthropotechnically marked, but got loose and is today out of human control or influence. Plus, the future as infinite and open horizon of time and as resource for contingent and individual action is constantly shutting down due to the impact of third nature and does not seem to open up again. What does this mean with regard to possibilities not only to access the non-human world, and even more to initiate a dialogue with the non-human world? So for one, as I have mentioned already, there's almost no non-human world left in the Anthropocene. Of course, there are still animals, plants, rocks, etc., but the clear divide between these entities or life forms, to make use of a term by Agamben, and the human species has become insecure. This is not so much in the direction of a questioning of the integrity and distinctiveness of the human species towards its entanglement with the non-human. Instead, it is the non-human that has become ever more affected by humane influence. Its shape, representation, and articulation increasingly follows the determining logic of anthropogenic shape, gesture, and identity. In the Anthropocene, even the non-human will is increasingly anthropified. In how far, speaking about the non-human world, which is intellectually a highly appreciated concept, is still possible at all, is highly questionable and needs to be examined as closely as urgently. Under such conditions, any dialogue with the non-human world is necessarily becoming precarious, as this dialogue consequently does not reevaluate the integrity of the non-human other, but applies to an anthropocentric terminology, perspective, and even if ethically benign intention. So far, a dialogue with the non-human lacks either common language, as has been said already, due to the non-accessibility of the non-human, or it still follows anthropocentric or at least anthropogenic terms. Even descent approaches like Povinelli's geontology focus eventually on questions about an understanding of the human existence. To this background, it still seems to be fruitful to follow Prof. Rabinow and imply an anthropology of reason that reflects on the precondition of human life, culture, and society, from which then also derives the non-human as other or derivative. Thank you so much for your attention. So I will disconnect.
Wow, thank you very much, Jörn, if I may, for this intriguing input. And I think it's a pity that we cannot just start for the next 2 hours discussing only your panel. But I'm afraid that the other two panelists have equally intense and thought-provoking inputs. So before I'll open the discussion, I would like to hand over to Professor Dr. Charlotte Rickley-Asante. And she is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Resource Development at the University of Ghana. At Ghana University, she also officiates as a co-director of the Maria Sibylla Merian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa. So again, a very warm welcome to you. Her main research interests include gender, urbanization, climate change, and empowerment issues in Ghana. In this field, she explores the causal nexuses between crime and poverty, and the gender dynamics of crime and safety in urban public spaces. Moreover, Charlotte Rickley-Asante studies gendered livelihoods and informal cross-border traders. Recently, She has also been engaging with the gendered implications of climate change, leading a case study on Ghanaian smallholder agricultural farmers, where she also explored the gender differences in their adaptation strategies. Taldrikli Asante has been publishing widely about her research, and I just want to mention her latest articles that appeared in the Ghana Journal of Geography, GeoJournal, and Journalist of Feminist Geography. This year, she also contributed to a collective book towards water-secure societies, coping with water scarcity and quality challenges. So I'm pretty much looking forward to your paper on Reflections on Africa and the Anthropocene, Climate Change Adaptation Practices in Rural Ghana. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you, organizers, for inviting me to be part of this program, workshop, and discussion. So if I may quickly start sharing my slide. Yeah. So I hope it's fine.
It's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And so I am going to focus more on some research, some work done in Ghana specifically, and then link it up with this whole concept of Anthropocene. And so I'm going to just give a broad overview of the situation of climate change in Africa and then Ghana specifically, and then use some of the works, my own work and what others have done, to share the experiences of smallholder farmers when it comes to climate change issues. And so as a way of introduction, I think the previous speaker has talked a lot about some of these things, that globally there is evidence. He mentioned climatologists and others, the scientists have shown and are still predicting that climate change is impacting on the ecological, social, and economic systems of the planet Earth that we live on. And so there are consequences on the resources that we depend on as human beings for our very sustenance. The freshwater resources, the forest products, settlements, and even the human health. Climate change is impacting on all of that. And the challenging aspect is that it's threatening their lives and livelihoods, particularly those who depend on these resources directly for their livelihoods, both men and women and their families. So climate change is something that is threatening the lives of human beings. I'm sure you are all familiar with that. But it varies regionally. It's not the same on the surface of the earth, as we all know. And Africa as a continent, it's known to be one of the vulnerable continents to the consequences of climate change, even though there are arguments and debates that we are contributing less to this whole climate change canker. But rather, we are also suffering the consequences the more. And Africa is vulnerable because there are other pressing challenges within the continent. And so climate change is kind of an added-on challenge for the continent. Poverty is a major a critical issue that governments or countries are struggling to deal with, and widening inequalities, particularly within the urban spaces. Urbanization is a key problem within Africa, and is growing, and there are urban poverty is becoming a major challenge. And then in addition, climate change is also impacting on the lives and livelihoods of people. I mean, Africa has resources, but managing these resources is very problematic. And so we are saddled with many challenges, including climate change. And so the capacity of our African countries to adapt to these climatic changes is a major problem. So within Africa itself, there are also differences, you know, in terms of time and place. But the hardest hit, and literature, I mean, many studies have shown that the World Bank IPCC has shown that the agricultural sector is the hardest hit in terms of climate change, and particularly the vulnerable groups of people within our rural settings, because they depend on agriculture directly as their major source of livelihood. And so the hardest hit is the agricultural sector. So I'm going to focus on the agricultural sector because I'm going to focus on the smallholder farmers. And so agriculture is still a major, it plays a major role within the continent, even though now there are statistics to show that commerce is taking over, but agriculture is still major, particularly for the rural people. And they depend on that directly for their socioeconomic lives and livelihoods. But climate change is impacting on agri in several ways. Stress water resources is affecting agriculture. The heat stress for people, livestock, and plants. There are extinction of crop varieties and animal species, and increasing incidence of pests and crop diseases. And all of these contribute to reduction in crop yields. And once there's a reduction in crop yields, the farmer, the rural farmer, is directly affected. So for those who depend directly on agriculture as their major source of livelihood, climate change is altering what they can do and their ability to manage these resources and even assess some traditional safety nets that they've been dependent on. So in Ghana, just a brief background, at least some of you may know, others may not really know where Ghana is located. Ghana is in West Africa, is located within these latitudes and longitudes, and is a tropical country, you know, and strongly influenced by the West African trade winds. And so the intertropical convergence zones, controls the rainfall patterns. So we have traditionally have two major rainfall patterns depending on the ITCZ, the position of the ITCZ. And so there's a major rainy season and then a minor rainy season. Traditionally, that farmers, the ordinary farmer, the rural farmer, they have studied these patterns over the year and they are aware of these patterns when it rains or when it's expected to rain and the dry season and all of that. But these patterns are shifting, and I'm going to share some of the experiences from our rural farmers and how it's impacting on their lives and livelihoods. In Ghana, majority of agricultural producers, they are smallholder farmers, and they depend on what we call the rain-fed type of agriculture. They depend directly on the rains. And so there's rain-fed crops that are highly vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. And 45% of the workforce still depend on rain-fed type of agriculture. Very few use irrigation sources to do their agricultural activities. The fishery sectors also, which falls under agriculture, it provides livelihoods for about 2.2 million people. So you clearly realize the majority of them, these are smallholder and small-scale subsistence farmers, and they depend on that directly for household food security. So as a result, both male and female smallholder farmers, they have to adapt to the challenges associated with climate change. And so I am just going to use an example of studies that I was personally involved in to explain or to show you some of the adaptation strategies that they have been using over the last few years. We decided to choose the transitional zone. These are the major agroecological zones within Ghana. And the transitional zone is a major zone that produces a lot of food crops for the country. It falls between the forest and then the savanna zone. And most of the staple food that we eat in our country comes from this particular zone. But this zone is also one of the highly vulnerable zones after the savanna region. And so farmers in this zone are also, very vulnerable to the extreme weather events that has been happening over the years. For instance, drought, in terms of drought. Once there's drought, they are in trouble because they don't know when to plant and when to harvest and all of that. Remember, I said they have studied the traditional patterns over the year. So they know that by April, May, June, it's going to rain. So they need to plant somewhere around March or something of that sort. But once it doesn't rain around that time and they've planted, it means they're running at a loss. And household food security is a major, major challenge for many of these farmers and its other implications. And so there are concerns about some of the erratic rainfall patterns and the uncertainties about the planting regimes, and that also induces diseases and pests leading to mass crop failure. And both male and female farmers, they are affected more by drought related than floods in that particular zone. And the emphasis on the drier conditions are very, very important because it decreases food crop production, which is a major, major thing for many of our smallholder farmers. And so this rate, and I'm talking about, if you can see this picture, these are some of the smallholder farmers that we have in Ghana generally. They depend on this directly for their very sustenance. So we selected communities from two major regions in that zone. And these are some of the observed changes that the farmers themselves highlighted. And so these are results that we found from the field based on the research that we did. And there have been several other research to confirm some of these findings. One of the key things is that there's late onset of the rainy season. Like I said, they've studied the patterns over the year and they realize that the patterns have changed. For instance, this particular year, we are in October and now it's raining heavily. Unlike the past, when we were younger, we knew the rainy season was about June, July. Now the pattern has changed. And these are observations. The ordinary people have even observed some of these patterns. So imagine the impact on smallholder farmers. And there's also early cessation of the rainy season. It means shorter rains, uncertainty about the onset of the rainy season, and sometimes erratic rainfall patterns. There could also be long dry spells during the rainy in between, and then less rain, or sometimes more rain, and that could lead to floods. Some parts have experienced floods. And whether drought or flood has impact on the agricultural sector and impact on the smallholder farmer. Rising day temperatures and the rising nighttime temperature could be extremely hot. As we speak, today it's very, very hot, And so these are some of the observed changes that the farmers themselves are observing, as patterns that have changed over the years. And one of the key implications is the decrease in terms of production. A typical farmer will even tell you that, in the past, I could get 20 bags of maize, for instance, on this plot. Now I'm getting only 5 bags or 6 bags. They will tell you some are based on their own understanding. But in all of these, the farmers are adapting to these changes. Of course, they must survive. It's their livelihood. So they are adapting. And there are several types of adaptation strategies that they have embarked on. There are on-farm agronomic practices and then off-farm practices that the smallholder farmers are embarking on. For instance, some have moved into the use of fertilizers, early planting, either they plant early or early harvesting, or planting 2 or more crops, or using drought-resistant varieties, and all early maturing varieties or late maturing varieties, and all kinds of agronomic adaptation practices, just to help them to be able to sustain their livelihoods and to be able to sustain their socioeconomic lives at the household level. Some of the off-farm adaptation strategies, and this is one of the major strategies that the farmers are moving into. That's diversification into new lucrative businesses, cashew production. Many farmers in that zone are moving into cashew, and the understanding is that cashew is a drought-resistant crop. And cashew can withstand even very poor soils. But we realize that it is rather the males, as compared to the female farmers, that are moving into this new lucrative business, because you require huge acres of land or land to be able to move into cashew production. But we've realized that many women do not have access to land. Land is being controlled by the men, and men have the ability as compared to the women. And so you realize you can, even though it's a very lucrative adaptation strategy, many women cannot have access as compared to the men, cannot move into that. And others have also moved into new livestock production. Of course, also you need the resources to be able to move into that. You find many women rather doing the petty trading, what we call petty trading, and household durables and consumer durables and all of that. But you cannot compare that into cashew production, for instance. Others are also using some of the ecosystem product that is available, even though very low because of, again, environmental degradation, like illegal mining and things are also going on, contributing to the challenge. And one of the key strategies for the male youth, agriculture is no longer attractive for the youth in Ghana and maybe in Africa in general. The youth are moving into the urban areas. And that's why urbanization is also becoming a major problem in this part of the world and in Ghana specifically. Because agriculture is no longer attractive, there are challenges, and the male youth in particular, are moving to the cities as a way of adapting to some of these challenges. So in conclusion, I would say that the smallholder farmers, they are aware of changes. There's evidence to show, several other studies are showing their impacts is impacting on their livelihoods, impacting on household food security, health, and others. And there are consequences that they are going through. But they are resilient. The resilience of the rural farmer in adapting to climate change. And both male and female are trying to adapt to these climatic changes. But you realize that the women are being constrained because of their limited access to resources. Like I said, cashew production is an emerging, major adaptation crop. But you find many men are moving into that because they have access to the resources as compared to the women. So I agree with this argument that Austin is making, that the Anthropocene is shaped by humans. But human beings, they have also responded, and they are responding and adapting to these new challenges and these new and environmental challenges. And Anthropocene in Africa has experienced processes of adaptation and the introduction of new crops, because people must survive. People have to sustain themselves because they depend on these things. The farmers depend on these directly for their sustenance. And so they are also finding, even though the argument is that they are contributing to all of these climatic changes, human beings themselves, the smallholder farmer, is also contributing or trying to sustain itself and trying to be resilient to all of these challenges. So I think that we need to strengthen the resilience of these farmers through the support of both our government and our governmental institutions, and that we should pay more attention to the smallholder farmers. And in doing that, we need to really take the gender dimensions critically into that, because the smallholder female farmer already has constraints. And in addition, climate change is also, impacting on their lives, and their ability to adapt as compared to the male is a bit critical, because it also ensures, agriculture ensures food security at the household level. I just brought this picture. Planting for Food and Jobs is one of the initiatives in Ghana now by the government in trying to address the challenges, including climate change, for particularly our smallholder farmers. And I think we need more of these initiatives to be able to support the smallholder farmers at the rural level. Then we need broader engagement. We need more research. And that's why I'm very happy that this conference is being organized to be able to discuss this whole concept of this Anthropocene. We need also to do more research to be able to figure out the nexus or the linkages between that and then climate change. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks to you, Charlotte. That really was an impressive case study. And I already have the feeling that it really did speak to the first paper, because in a way it also talked about the future perspective, if adaptation is something that points into the future. So I believe that there are very interesting questions that bring together already the first two papers. But before we discuss that, we are going to hear a third paper given by Professor Dr. Christoph Mauch. And I'm happy to welcome you again. I think it's been like maybe 15 years or so we last met in person. So unfortunately today we cannot meet in person, but at least we see us digitally, and I'm happy to welcome you. Christoph Mauch is chair in American Culture and Transatlantic Relations at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, where he also serves as affiliated professor in the Faculty of History. Furthermore, and I didn't know that, he is an honorary professor at Renmin University in China, and he officiates as co-director of the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society. Originally, Christoph Mauch engaged with the history of the United States and the study of transatlantic relations. Afterwards, he expanded his research area towards environmental history and subsequently towards global environmental history. His latest publications include Slow Hope, Rethinking Ecologies of Crisis and Fear, which appeared only 2 years ago. And then I'll give you the title in English, Primeval Forest for the Bavarians, History, Politics and Nature in the Bavarian Forest National Park, appeared 2020, and Paradise Blues, of this in search of the American nature, is the title in English. He has also been publishing extensively in reviews and collective works, his most recent articles appearing in the reviews Global Environment and Environmental Humanities. So I'm really looking forward to your paper on We Are All Earthlings. challenges for historians in a more than human world. Christoph, it's your turn.
Buen día a todos y gracias.
A very good morning to you all, and thank you for the invitation.
Angelika, and thank you also to Olaf for inviting me, and I'm also very happy to see that Christina Norwig is here. Let me just mention, at least, I think I need to do that. I can never apply for Käthe Hamburg or Merian Institute again, so you can believe me that I'm not biased here. I think that these formats are the most forward-looking and the most innovative and the most powerful formats and genres that the ministry has developed in a century, at least in over a century, since the German Historic Institutes were established in the 19th century. At any rate, I'm happy to be here, and I have to apologize, like every real German. I think we start with an apology. I have to apologize. I don't have a presentation. Well, I have a presentation, but I don't have images. But I don't know, some of you may have read Stephen King. I don't like Stephen King's novels, but I do like one book that he wrote that I recommend to all of you. It's called On Writing. And you should read the passage in which he tells you how he establishes an image, a pub. You just need the sign of the pub, the door, the doorbell, and the bar, and already you have an image in your mind. So I hope you'll get these images yourself. Angelika just mentioned that I was a political historian. Actually, I was a secret intelligence historian to start with. And in a way, I believed for ages, and I mean, maybe I shouldn't say I believed it for ages, but historians have believed for thousands of years that we can explain how the world is moved, how things happen on the earth, just by understanding what politicians, royals, all sorts of protagonists such as diplomats, dictators, parliamentarians have done. This has explained how one empire came, another came, how invasions happened, intentions, looking at text. This was what political historians have done. This is how I grew up, in a very conservative, I mean, the most ultra-conservative. Secret intelligence is probably the most ultra-conservative approach. I've then changed to social, we all changed to social history to some extent. We realized that people who didn't leave records behind, the working class, for instance, is really important, but we should study them, and we can't study them on the basis of texts like we did it with politicians, etc. And we've seen a rise in understanding that the invisible, those who didn't leave texts were powerful and had their own agendas, their own way to live, and were exploited, etc. We also have seen a very strong cultural turn in recent years, and we realize that tastes matter, perceptions matter, and about the same time, environmental history has risen. It's a very small field. On one hand, it's a small field. On the other hand, I would say it's an umbrella, a topic, because it brings so many other disciplines in, and that's what excites me. And when Jörn said before, well, he basically told us the story of techno-determinism. I think I have a very different story. I'm going to focus much more on biology today. Well, environmental historians, today, I think it's obvious to all of us that environmental history is powerful and can explain a lot. In Germany, we just saw that hundreds of people died as a result of the flood. So nature can be an actor. The wildfires that we saw in Turkey look like the ones in Australia. Loire Valley 2 years ago looked like the Sahara. So nature as an actor is something that was brought into our minds. That's one thing. But at the same time, environmental historians have very much pointed out that our perception matters, our perception of nature, what we do with nature. Let's say in Canada, the oil sands, whether we leave them in the sand or whether we take the oil out, makes a big difference. Jörn mentioned before that he said that there's everything is, how did he call it? He mentioned that the world is no longer pristine, and the world around us has been reshaped by us. We've reshaped the animal world. If you go back 500 years, You all know that. You all know it because we are discussing the Anthropocene. But 8 years ago, when we at the Rachel Carson Center started an exhibition on the Anthropocene, the Director General of the museum said, you can't call something the Anthropocene because nobody knows that term. But today we all know what has happened. We know that we have shaped the world around us. For instance, animals, if you go back to the Middle Ages, the weight of the wild animals was much heavier than the weight of the farm and ranch animals. Today, at least 80% of the weight of mammals and humans together is the animals that we have raised ourselves, created ourselves, either to eat or to work for us or to be living with us. So the world around us has changed dramatically, and there is indeed hardly any pristine landscape left. We need the whole continent of Africa for our animals, the whole continent in size of Latin America for our crops, and Europe and Australia together in size for the built environment, like urban culture that Charlotte has just explained to us. But I think it's too reductionist to just claim that we are actors vis-a-vis nature, and nature is through floods, for instance, or through earthquakes. I mean, this is all happening in Guadalajara to some extent. We know that earthquakes had a major impact on political regimes, even. But so nature is an actor vis-a-vis humans and vis-a-vis society. Society is an actor vis-a-vis nature. Humans are actors vis-a-vis nature. But I think this is not enough for us. For our understanding, we need something much more sophisticated, and that's we need to understand the more than human world in a different way. Let me give you 3 examples. The first one is, so I'm looking at creatures. The first one is a creature, it's probably less big than my fingernail on the small finger. But that creature has had an impact that is enormous. Over the centuries, that creature has killed billions of people on Earth, humans. It has been used for biological warfare. It has had, I say this as an Americanist, more of an impact on the outcome on the American independence than General George Washington, who was not a good general. He was actually a very bad general. So it was easy for the mosquito probably to have more impact. But certainly, I mean, the mosquito has had an impact. And it's if we just go with the dichotomy of humans as actors and nature as an actor, we forget that there are creatures that have been powerful and have also, to some extent, for instance, contributed to the exploitation of humans. I'm talking about Africans who have been able to develop certain types of cells that prevented them from getting malaria, and that has contributed to the rise, for instance, of the African slave trade. So I want to alert you to the fact that these little creatures are actors in history as well. Today, I mean, we are looking at cutting-edge history writing and cutting-edge knowledge production. I think that's my first important example. But let me look at another example, an American example, again, as an Americanist, cattle, specifically longhorn cattle. And Texas longhorns, they have roamed around the grasslands of Texas, the prairie, the grasslands, in an area where you can't really grow wheat or rice or corn or any of these. But cows, cattle can live there. You know, these longhorns, they used to be quite wild, and they have, I claim, created the cowboy. They have created a certain type of human. I mean, first of all, there would be no cowboy without horses and without cows, obviously. But these 2 animals have only arrived with Columbus. Before that, there were no cows and horses, so there could not have been a cowboy. I mean, that's simple. But I think what's much more interesting is that the cows had to change and the humans had to change to live together to create the prairie as a niche for humans. What I mean by that, thousands of years ago, cows have developed the ability genetically to feed on certain types of grasses. I've looked at cows that were imported from Switzerland to California. They all died because they didn't have the right grass, so they had to import that grass from Switzerland as well. But certainly, it shows that cows had to adopt to grasses. But at the same time, humans have adopted to cows. I mean, why would a cow be of interest to a Texas farmer if we couldn't digest the muscle of the cows that we've created? And why not if we couldn't drink the milk? But in the 19th century, when these big cattle farmers, ranchers, started in America, only about 25% of the human population was able to drink milk from cows. So what I'm getting at is the co-evolution of humans and creatures, big mammals like cattle. But I will go one step further. So one can say, and this is something that Tim McCain would argue, who has a materialist perspective, very different from the total cultural focus. He would say that a house of a cowboy, or not the cowboy, but the cattle king who built big houses in Texas, let's say, that house needed energy to be built. And that energy is produced not by the cowboy, but by the cow. So it's co-produced. The space, the grassland is co-produced by cows and humans. Even the wealth of the cattle king is co-produced by cows and humans. And my third example, I don't even have to go very far. We all think about it. I mean, I'm just coming from teaching at the Technical University where, so I was just wearing a mask. I don't need one in my office here, but yeah. We are living in a world in which microbes, all types of microbes, viruses, of course, but all sorts of bacteria play a major role and are actors. So we see that we are all connected through these microbes. And in a way, there's very little difference between me here and the air around me. It's all full of bacteria, all full of viruses. They determine whether we live or not. Now let me come to somehow I'm trying to come up with a conclusion. When I came up with the title, We Are All Earthlings, I didn't even know what an earthling was. I just thought I would give you a provocative title. But I think what I mean by that is twofold. For once, I think it's important to realize that we live on one Earth that is distinct. It's a globe that cannot be cut off into compartments. And we've heard from Charlotte that the climate is really influencing there's a monsoon, the climate is something global, temperature rise is something global, but we also know that pollution is something global. Yes, I'm a professor in China and at the People's University, at the Communist University, and I mean, we are very critical of China. Often we say, oh, well, they produce so much pollution, and I've had to wear masks long before I was wearing masks here when I went to China every year. But the reality is that at least 40% of the pollution in China comes from Europe and North America, because the products that they produce go to us. So looking at the globe as something that is interconnected through climate change, through pollution, through our export of cars, or through all sorts of, our cell phones that we export to other parts of the world where people are getting sick in their bodies because we export our cell phones and people are taking out some of the metals, shows that we are connected. The globe has to be seen as one thing, not just in compartments. The globe is also an earth in the sense of earthiness. And I really like the approach of Charlotte on agriculture, because I think it's so important to look at agriculture and really like to know something about her, more about whether smallholders, they're leaving into cities is not also dangerous. Because it's important to understand, as soon as you leave the countryside, you lose your understanding of the earth. And losing the understanding of the earth has led to the biggest environmental catastrophe in the history of the United States. That was the Dust Bowl, because people didn't realize that the topsoil was flying away with these big machines that were were used to grow wheat and destroyed the topsoil. We have lost 50% on the globe. 50% of the topsoil in the last 150 years. What does that mean for the future? And we've lost it in part because we didn't realize what was happening, because the suitcase farmers were looking at it. So I want us to think about the earth as one earth, to which we have no alternative, but also as something that is earth, that is soil. And when I said in the beginning, it's obvious that floods today, they're actors. We see floods as actors. We see earthquakes as actors. We see nature as an actor. I think we have to differentiate that. Yes, it does make a difference whether we plant here in Bavaria, whether we plant corn, for instance, that leads to more flooding. But we should not underestimate the role of earthworms, little creatures, bigger than mosquitoes, and maybe more important to some extent, extremely important, because we've just gotten rid of 45%, I think, of the earthworm population in Germany within only 10 years, between 2006 and 2016. Some of the floods that we are seeing could have been prevented if earthworms had worked the earth, because they make the soil more porous. So neglecting the animal world, neglecting mosquitoes, neglecting microbes, neglecting the co-evolution of humans and animals would be highly problematic. So here, I think historians, I know it's difficult, and I don't quite know how to do it, but I think historians have to take into account the more than human world. We have to realize that the earth and all its creatures are co-constituting us, have constituted us in history, will co-constitute us in the future. We can't live without them. We are totally entangled. We are entangled on the globe, globally. We're also entangled with the creatures around us that have given us the current pandemic and will give us many more in the future. But I'd like to end by saying, if we understand that, it's not just fear-provoking. I think the first two papers were very much about fear. It's important to look at how technology is determining us and is taking away our liberties and is taking away our future, if you will. And it's also important to look at how our livelihoods are destroyed, as Charlotte has shown us. But I think if we understand that we are all earthlings, there could be a step in a positive direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And I mean, with your last comment, I feel that you have already addressed one of the big questions in the digital room we are all joining now. How do all the papers relate to the question of an open future, and what is their understanding of nature? And well, I do not want to anticipate the discussion, but the floor is now open for all participants. And if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat and or raise your hand. I'm just changing the view so that I can see raised hands. And I'm not sure if I can always realize who was first, but at the moment there's only one hand raised. So Werner Gebhardt, this is easy. It's your turn.
Thank you very much for those wonderful presentations. I'm a little bit concerned about the question whether we really excluded two interesting dimensions as well. Let me say the example of Charlotte, that adaptations to a new climate situation would include a possibility for women and men in general to change to cashew production, for example. That was your example. But you said in the same time, this is not possible in the same way for women than for men. So the reason behind is certainly a cultural one, having access to land, to heritage questions. That is the normative and legal system, if I understand right. So it would be, in terms of the first contribution, something of the second nature that would determine possibilities, resilience, strategies, etc. If I understand right. So my question, did I get it right? And this is linked to the problematic that in the whole debate, the normative aspect, having rights to nature as a natural right, is a great debate in the normative disciplines and needs to be reflected as well. I would say it is an important aspect of treating the question how to react to the challenges of climate change. So culture on the one side and the normative framing I was missing in those, except there is, it's not a critique, but it's a further additional point that seems to be important for me to those wonderful presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Werner Gebhardt. Charlotte, might you start with an answer? So could you have to unmute your
Yeah, thank you very much for it. He says as a comment. Yes, I totally agree. Yes, I focus on that because you know, I was looking at things from the gender perspective, and culture indeed plays a major role, you know, at least from our context here in Ghana, maybe other parts of Africa. And that really plays a major role. And that's why I argue that in thinking about all of these and how to adapt, we really have to look at things from the gender perspective, because both male and female have a role to play in all of these. If we leave things as it is, particularly for us in this context, it may be problematic. Only half or a percentage of the population will feel that they have to play that role. So it's very, very important that we look at things from the gender perspective. But I totally agree to the point, and it's something that we may have to look at. Thank you very much.
So thank you. Maybe the other two would like to add to the question about the normative setting.
Well, obviously, Werner Gebhardt, you as a lawyer, as a law person, you are missing this, and I can only agree. You know, as a historian, we're here to describe. As soon as we are supposed to come up with a solution, we stop. We're good at explaining what the problems are. And then when somebody comes up with a solution, we are good at critiquing the solution, but we are not here as a discipline to be normative. At the same time, I cannot agree enough with the, bringing out the aspect of gender, and Charlotte has brought it out. And from our fellows who've come to us, it's so obvious that climate change has asymmetrically and impacted females across the globe. If you look at flooding and all sorts of pollution, and let's say in Nigeria, but all over the globe, I think we've seen that. So I think these are important topics. As far as you mentioned the right to nature, not the right of nature. Of course, in line with my presentation, I would have to, even though I'm not sure that it's a realistic debate, something that we can realize globally. But of course, the right of nature, the derechos de la naturaleza, the giving a right to creatures out there, giving a right to rivers, giving a right to mountains, is for me one of the interesting questions in a dialogue with law.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's even a question
Jörn?
to Werner Gebhardt. Yeah.
So I just
I guess
can
that
say
Jörn,
that at our center, we had really a lot of debates just about these questions. The old one, do rocks have rights? Yes. And we have more and more indicators for indications that justice and legal systems do accept such a view. And this is really a completely new way to think legally the world, because in former times, we only thought that subjects, human subjects, could be the bearers of subjective rights, and we have to change. But there is a lot of categorical work and also of political practice necessary in order to transmit this message. Excuse me, I was too long, sorry.
No, thank you. That was, I believe, an important input. But Jörn, I feel you would also like to answer that question of concerning normativity.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree to what has been said already. I mean, the question of normativity is absolutely in the foreground here. So, I mean, if we do speak about the Anthropocene and about the challenges emerging here, so there's no alternativity to normativity, of course. But the question is, if we do equip rocks and rivers and any other entity with rights, how do we do that? So how has law have to change? How does our legal institutions have to change if we're doing this? So the question, of course, is how does this subaltern as nature speak? And how do we make it speak? Because so far, it's just our language. And sometimes I do have the feeling that translating the language and the needs of these entities into the language of law is not only kind of demanding, but nearly impossible. So far, it's a human view which is speaking, and this is, of course, not enough.
Olaf Kaltmeier has the next question.
Yeah, thank you all three for this very inspiring panel. I have a question on this idea of third nature. Does it also imply other forms of third nature which are not monstrous? So I'm thinking of, because if not, it probably has a certain Western capitalist bias to analyze the transformations in this context, but thinking, for example, of new research on indigenous communities and the Amazon region, where we see that their transformation of pristine nature creates even higher levels of biodiversity than, for example, wild forests. Is this also? Could this be a perspective? Where does it fit in this idea? And a more general question is about, if we think about this co-evolution, co-constitution, obviously we have to think about interdisciplinarity, not only into law, but also in regard to life sciences, biology, and so on. And what could be a social science perspective, cultural studies perspective in this sense? Because I see that there's also always a possibility, so to say, of colonization of social sciences by biological thought in a certain way. So what could be the real stance of social sciences in a broader sense in this co-constitution of systems of human nature interactions, if you want to use these terms?
Okay, thank you. So who would like to answer first, Jörn or Christoph? Jörn. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Many thanks for the very interesting question. I mean, with this idea or concept of third nature, I'm approaching a nature which has been transformed by human activities, especially by societies, by industrialized societies, and by practice of an exploitation and extraction of nature, of course. So the interesting perspective which you're bringing in now is that, of course, absolutely different concepts of nature exist beyond this perspective. So this concept of third nature obviously attaches to a Western view on nature, and this idea of a pristine nature is, of course, only a sort of first nature which did never exist. I mean, from the very moment on that we realize nature as nature, it is totally clear that this nature does not exist, because the idea of nature is the result of a detachment from nature already. So, I mean, to realize that there is something out there which is nature is only due to the fact that we do live in an environment of second nature already. But this second nature is then producing practices and techniques of an alteration and transformation of its resources. And this is what I think is resulting in what I call third nature. And this is, of course, a nature which is there. It's still there. It is the nature that we're used to. It's like it's storms, it's drought, it's earthworms, it's longhorn cattle, whatever. But this nature is affected by human practices, and its very condition in the contemporary is due and dependent on human actions, and interestingly, very much it is dependent on human actions which have happened already in the past and which only affect us now. So third nature is, of course, trying then to realize that the nature we're dealing with today is a different kind of nature than, for instance, the nature that Philip Decollade describes in his studies about the Amazon societies, because it is a nature which has been adapted to human activities already, and now it is turning on us in a way which is, for us, totally uncontrollable.
And now, Christoph, would you like to follow up?
I agree, Jörn. You wouldn't believe it, but I do agree. Of course, but but I think, this entanglement between humans and the more than human world historically needs to also emphasize something that has been lost. I think we need to get back to Olaf's question. We need a ecologicization or a earthicization or a biologicalization of sciences, of social sciences. So we've had a cultural turn. I personally think that, and we can see that in a pandemic, if we don't understand what biology is, then we don't understand where the future is. So when I was little, I thought we would go to Mars, or when I was little, I thought, the space out there is physics, astrophysics. That's the most important thing. That will determine our future. Space shuttle, etc. But I think physics does not have the answers to the future of humans as much as biology and ecology. So that's why I'm emphasizing the more than human world and the entanglement with the human world. We may have power, and we have enormous power. And it's interesting. I don't know. It's probably 21st century. We're no longer so much interested in freedom. The question of freedom, we have lost freedom through this techno monstrosity, what you described before. But I think for me, one of the interesting things, that's how I define the Anthropocene, is that we have power, but we also have powerlessness. We are afraid of our own power, but we are also afraid of our powerlessness vis-a-vis our own power. And that's to understand that powerlessness helps. It helps to look at what we've done. You can do it very simply. If you do a James Bond movie, well, if you do a movie, you can you can do a nature fights back movie, but I think that's too simple. Okay, we damage the climate, then the climate fights back, etc. So how do we explain it more thoroughly? And I think historians cannot explain everything more thoroughly. I think we can describe the impact of society, all sorts of vulnerabilities that are social and ecological. And I really like that the way Charlotte described it. But in order to understand our powerlessness, I think we need to understand the biology.
Mm-hmm. Charlotte, would you like to add on also on the
to add on
point?
Thank you very much. Just to add on, yes, I totally agree. I think that's why it's important. Increasingly, there's interdisciplinary research. So I think that's a critical. I remember when we were doing our research. I am from the geography department. The geography, we have both human and then the physical geography. A climatologist was on board. I was a human geographer.
Oh, you're muted again. Sorry, you're muted again.
I'm sorry.
We heard the beginning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I said thank you very much. Yes, I totally agree with what the previous speaker has just said, and that interdisciplinary research is the way to go. And I was just giving an example of when we were doing research, any research that we do on climate change, for instance. I'm a social scientist, I'm a human geographer, and also a gender expert, but I don't do the work all alone. I do with climatologists. I'm from the geography department, and so they are physical geographers and human geographers. We work with agriculturists, people from the agric department. We work with others from maybe the economics department or whatever. So for me, I think that yes, as we move on to do more research about Anthropocene, issues about climate change, issues about the environment, we need, the way to go is that interdisciplinarity, because it will give a better meaning, better explanation. But you can't take social science out of that, because social scientists, we are studying the human being, and you can't take gender. I keep on insisting that you can't take gender, looking at things from the gender perspective. It's very, very important. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the next question has Christina Norwig.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much again for organizing this conference. It's extremely interesting, and I'm so happy to be here and to follow this really, really lively discussion. And I think it's very convincing hearing the last paper by Professor Mauch, how everything is entangled and how also creatures can be historical actors or agents, from huge cows to tiny microbes. And that made me think of the book by Katharina Kreuder-Sonnen on traveling microbes, where she investigates also the role of objects of the of objects in the history of science, and also this aspect of technology was very present in the paper of Jörn Ahrens, and also it was very visible or consequential in the paper of Professor Ripley Asante, when you demonstrated how people adapt to climate change, and of course they will adapt by changing their ways of farming, which also includes objects or technology. And Professor Ripley Asante, you just said that interdisciplinarity is the way to go. And actually, I had this question for everybody, for the panel. What are, in your view, the consequences of this entanglement of humans, of natures, of objects, technology, also given the global entanglements? What do cultural studies, what do humanities and social sciences need? Do we need evidently, we need interdisciplinary collaboration, but what does this mean for the disciplines? Is there the danger to somehow dilute disciplines? themselves, or is it a danger, or is it a chance for science? So this would be my question. What are the consequences for humanities, social sciences, cultural studies?
Now I'm muted. Thank you very much. Who would like to start if interdisciplinary means? Yes, Christoph.
I really like this question. I mean, the first thing I think that we have to deal with, I think we have to redefine what humans are. I think humans are no longer the same humans that we are becoming more and more cyborgs on one hand. That's what Jörn would be saying. Already, if you have a cell phone in your hand, you are becoming a cyborg. I've never had a cell phone where it's almost impossible to live on this globe without a cell phone. But we are also realizing that we are more animal. And what does it mean for the disciplines? I can hear in your question a certain fear of the fact that we lose the identity of our disciplines. And I'm also afraid of that. And I still like the old T model, that you should be deep in one discipline, but you should be able to speak to other disciplines. So at the Rachel Carson Center, we started an environmental studies program where everybody has to do social sciences, humanities, and social sciences, humanities, and natural sciences. And the consequence is that if you put a geologist and a theologian in the same room, they immediately talk differently when they speak to each other. So they can't use the jargon. They can still, when they talk, when a theologian talks to another theologian, they can still talk about exegesis and Genesis 1.
I'm happy now to welcome, and I'm also not only happy but really honored to welcome our two guest speakers, Deepesh Chakrabarti and Franz Maulshagen, for the interregional dialogue. And I feel that for us as audience and listeners, this will be something very special, because to my knowledge, this dialogue has been carried out already for quite a long time. And it's not the first time that you have that dialogue, but it might be, I'm not sure about that, you have to tell us. It might be for the first time that you share your dialogue with such an audience and that we are able to listen to you. And we have planned now that both of you give an input of roughly 20 minutes as we had it in the first round of the panel. And then we give you the chance to ask questions to each other. And then we continue with questions from the audience. So first I would like to introduce to you, well, I'm sure, and this is not only a mot de parler, but I'm sure that I really do not have to introduce Deepesh Chakrabarti to you, but there might be some details that you're not aware of. For instance, that he is Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, and I love that description of his chair in South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. So there are denominations that also point to interdisciplinarity. Here you hear history, languages, and civilizations. In addition, he currently officiates as the faculty director of the university's center in Delhi. Of course, is Deepesh Chakrabarti familiar to you, and he's best known for his reflections on human sciences very broadly. His thoughts on post-colonialism and on the study of the subalterns already have been inviting scholars to decentralize and rethink the worldviews of over 20 years. So decentralization has become a buzzword, I would like to say, in some contexts, but as we are going to learn over the conference and the series of the conference, maybe not in every respect, so there's still a lot to decentralize. Later on, Deepesh Chakrabarti addressed climate change by integrating the Anthropocene into his field of study. He has been seeking to make sense of this universal phenomenon while maintaining his suspicion towards universalism as a post-colonial researcher, and this combination makes his thinking very special. Deepesh Chakrabarty's latest publications are Some Aspects of Labor History of Bengal in the 19th Century, with Rana Dasgupta, The Crisis of Civilization, Exploring Global and Planetary Histories, 2018. And this year, he published The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. And Deepesh, I welcome you very with enthusiasm. It's great to have you again and to see you, and I'm looking forward to your paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Angelika, is my voice all right? Can you hear me? I've got a bit of a cold. Can you hear? Is the volume okay? It's okay, the volume? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the welcome. Great to be in this distinguished company, and wonderful to be in conversation with all of you, but especially with Franz, an old friend with whom I've always enjoyed discussing things. It's a struggle to disagree with them, so maybe we'll try to disagree again. But I was also very fascinated by the discussion that has gone on. So actually, Franz and I did have an informal discussion about what we might talk about today, but I'm also going to frame it in terms of the discussion that we've had, the question of the non-human, but also the question of interregional conversation. So the global north, global south conversation between them, and how the question of the non-human cuts across that conversation. And so taking a cue, Angelika, from what you were saying about the question of the suspicion of the universal. Now, that is something that grew in the human sciences, particularly with post-colonialism, but also with postmodernism in Europe. I mean, Lyotard wrote a book called The Postmodern Condition, in which the postmodern condition was described as taking a position of incredulity towards all the big stories of progress, advancement, whatever. So, so one could say that purely in the human sciences, the discussion of differences between different societies, the discussion of the history of empires, the discussion of how Europeans sometimes used universalist ideas to actually dominate people, and how sometimes even elsewhere modern states use unifying ideas in order to dominate people, led to a lot of literature that was suspicious of ideas that spoke in an immediate way of unity of humans. So anything that said humanity without talking about what divided humanity became suspicious. And post-colonialism contributed to it. Post-structuralists, Michel Foucault and Derrida, and these people also contributed to that hermeneutic of suspicion. And that, I would say, was part of the post-war democratization of the social sciences and the humanities, which gave rise to, in the discipline of history that I share so much with Christoph, the question of history from below. In Germany, it gave rise to the everyday history that Hans Medic and Alf Lütke initiated. So all this was very much a part of the democratization. On the other hand, the post-war, some sections of the post-war sciences were talking about the world being one. And I would say that the post-war security-driven, space competition-driven, military-driven, and nuclear bombs-driven interest on the part of the US and the Soviet Union in the atmosphere led to a rise in the importance of atmospheric sciences, atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric physics, which then had contributions made to it by the space sciences, particularly in the 60s, Carl Sagan's unit in NASA, which employed this British chemist called James Lovelock, and from whose work we got the idea of the Gaia, that the broad idea that the life on Earth actually does something to maintain the conditions that enable life to subsist on Earth. That idea was criticized, taken up, but the basic intuition of that idea, that the planet does something to actually, and life on the planet, different forms of life on the planet do something to help life continue in spite of 5 extinctions. That intuition eventually became elaborated in what we call Earth system science. And Earth system science, as a positive science, is the development of the 1980s. And it was in 1983, I think, that NASA set up their committee on Earth system science. But that line of thinking, it's fascinating. We were talking about biology before. It's fascinating that a bunch of scientists, very few of whom were biologists until Lynn Margulis and people came into the conversation, used to sit around in NASA and in asking the question whether Mars could be made inhabitable for humans, came up with the question, what is life? And I find it interesting that one of the books they were reading were a series of lectures given in Dublin by the physicist Schrödinger, thinking through thermodynamics and asking the question, what is life? So a biological question, which was already amenable to thermodynamic thinking, was coming up out of these researches, from which comes the science of global warming, and this idea that, as Christoph was saying, that we simply don't act on this planet. Our actions produce further actions on the part of the planet in its time, in the different planetary processes. And so I would say that on the one hand, in the world, there was stories growing that had to do with democratization of social science and humanities, which were fundamentally predicated on a suspicion of all claims of universality or all claims of one world. Whereas the scientific investigations, beginning with atmospheric sciences and the space sciences, then the question of global warming was creating a one world narrative. And the agency which we had created after the war, United Nations, which by the way initially was actually thought about as a substitute of the League of Nations, and one person very interested, as you know, instrumental in creating the Charter of the United Nations was Jan Smuts from South Africa, who believed in white supremacy and who thought that with the decline of Britain, the world order had to be changed, and the Americans and the Soviets had to be brought in charge of a world which would still be based on white supremacy, so that the job of colonizing the natives in Africa and elsewhere could go on. But that United Nations has evolved over time. And what was happening was that as we had planetary questions coming up, because of what was happening through our own institutional activities, the United Nations, which was meant to address global problems, was being landed with the job of addressing what you might call planetary problems. And the first instance of that is the crisis in the ozone layer, with the hole in the ozone layer in the 1980s, which the resolution of which led to the Montreal Protocol. So when the news of global warming broke, that human activities were warming up the surface temperature of the planet, the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, following the Montreal Protocol. So in other words, the institution that was created for global politics was being handed the job of addressing planetary crisis, and therefore taking on what you might begin to call planetary politics. Now, what's the distinction? One distinction as a historian I find is that when it came to questions of global politics, like if you ask the United Nations, when would the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Jews live in peace, the Arab Palestinians and the Jews, the answer would be, we don't know, we're working on it. So for all global problems, it was assumed that there was indefinite amount of time in human terms available to human beings for addressing those problems. But the other narrative that was coming from the scientists and through the IPCC was actually a narrative about a definite calendar of action within which you had to act. And it was in that context that the World Resources Institute published a document on global warming in 1988 or 89, when it was headed by the Yale economist Gaspeth, which said, we have a crisis for humanity. And it was in response to that statement by Gaspeth that two Indian environmentalists, Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, came out with the first statement of inequality and global warming, which was called Global Warming in an Unequal World, a case of environmental colonialism. And it was these people who first began to argue that you must not simply talk about humanity as a whole. You can't, as a unity, you can't talk about just emissions. You have to calculate emissions on a per capita basis. And then you will find that the industrialized nations had used up more than their fair share of the space that was needed for the amount of emissions that countries needed to make in order to industrialize. In other words, they were saying that the third world had been robbed of their right to pollute by the industrialized nations having polluted more than that was their fair share of pollution. But you know, the interesting thing was that this conversation was still about human history. So if you read Agarwal and Narayan, they were talking about history of imperialism. Some people in their wake would talk about history of capitalism. Some people will talk about rich nations versus poor nations. Some people would extend that today, global north versus global south. And you will today say that the global north runs through all the countries. The global south runs through all the countries. So that geographical division where third world was different from the first world has now broken down into a proposition where you actually say that there's people living in conditions of the global south in every country. And there are people living in conditions of the global north in every country. So that old geographical distribution has been somewhat complicated, but what also has complicated this question is the question of the non-human, which initially looked like question of the big non-humans, like the climate system of the planet, or the deep oceanic currents, or the role of the glaciers, or the role of the Amazon forests, which is huge in terms of its area, or the role of the Siberian permafrost, or the role of the polar regions and the polar ice cap. But it was also becoming clear, as they asked this question, the scientists, what is life? And why does life persist? And this is a contribution that has come from the sciences. No human culture before the sciences could have actually dreamt this up, is the fact, but the point that we know now, that the majority forms of life on this planet are microbial. And microbial and very small forms of life, like bacteria, viruses, protists, like fungi, phytoplanktons, they play the most critical role in maintaining the basis for life's continuity on the planet. So the question of this question, the reason why I say the question has become complicated is this. So if you look at macro factors, the so-called great acceleration graphs, one of the things you begin to realize that from the 1950s on, particularly from the 1970s on, and the graphs go up even later when China begins to industrialize, that if you look at all the figures for growth of humans, growth of cars, consumption of electricity, land use, if you could forget for a moment the problem of the environment and climate change, you would think that you were living in a Steve Pinker world, the world that Steve Pinker describes, where humans, that question that can't ask in the conflict of faculties. Can the human species go on improving continuously? And he has an ironical answer to it. But Steve Pinker has a very non-ironical answer to it. He said all the data shows we are continuously improving our situation. This environmental problem is a blip, we'll solve it technologically, blah, 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 whatever. If you forgot the climate problem, you think this is a wonderful period for human beings. Even the poor begin to live longer. And actually, we do bring people out of poverty. If you look at the number of people who become consumers, you know, from 1986, when the number of people who were consumers was about 1 billion, it's now 4 billion. And we're going to add another 5 to it. And remember when China began to industrialize, Deng Xiaoping actually began with the statement that we need to follow this path of partial capitalist development in order to bring millions out of poverty, which he argued their kind of socialism was not doing. And while the global inequalities have risen, and urbanization has risen as a result of this development of the last, I would say from the Reagan Thatcher years, really particularly, when the West, particularly the Anglo-West, deindustrialized and creating this room for China to become the world's factory. This period is the most wonderful period of human flourishing if you didn't take into account the price of this flourishing. And the climate change is like somebody handing us the bill later saying, hey, you've been living so well, here is the bill for it. But when the question is climate change produces, we're talking about futures before, interestingly, but the climate change, I often feel that now that we know about the non-human, now that we know about the pandemic, that the fact that the pandemic and climate change come out of the same problems. One common problem to both narratives being the destruction of forests and wildlife losing habitat, viruses in the stomachs of wildlife like bats, much more older species than human, 50 million year old, traveling then through intermediate animals into our bodies, then our bodies becoming evolutionary pathways for the viruses. Now that we know all this connectivity, this complicates the question of the interregional conversation in two ways. One is that you realize that even though the poor are not at all responsible for the historic emissions of greenhouse gases, but the poor also partake of the condition of humanity in the sense that it is thanks to the development of public health measures, antibiotics, hospitals, etc., that even the poor live longer. And that's one reason why the human numbers have grown. And the human numbers have grown astonishingly. In 1900, we were 1.6 billion. In 2000, we were 6 billion. Now we're 8, going on to 9 or 10. The only falling number actually is human fertility, which is interesting. And we can talk about that. Now, let me end by saying I've got 2 more minutes left, I think. Is that so, Angelika, or have I got more? Have I got 3?
Yeah, you get 3.
Okay, good. Thank you. This is called tough bargaining. Anyway, so the way it becomes very complicated, I think, and very interesting, and this goes back to the discussion that Zoltan was also participating in, is the question of the future. So the environmental crisis is actually, I think, creating many futures and fragmented futures. Some futures come as a kind of a present we all want to inhabit. So if you think about the distribution of vaccination and access to vaccination during the pandemic, we all want for the inequality to end and for all of us to have access to the vaccination, even if some of us by choice remain anti-vaxxers. So that's a present we fully want to occupy. If you think that the climate change narrative is about a civilizational crash of this civilization based on Western capitalism or global capitalism, then you're talking like about several decades. If you think that the climate change narrative is about a great extinction of life, now that somebody like Anthony Barnowski would say could happen it may have started. But a great extinction doesn't happen overnight. It happens over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. And Anthony Barnowski says that this will really happen in the next 300 to 600 years. Now, that is much more difficult for humans to inhabit mentally because of human sense of time. So in a way, what makes the negotiation of this crisis difficult is that first of all, we have an institutional deficit. We're using the United Nations to deal with planetary problems. The United Nations is a bargaining platform. So one can say all the IPCC calendars, which is kind of a one world calendar, that's the calendar that people bargain with nations to get more time. So that future that the IPCC scenarios tell, I mean, we will possibly miss those times on those calendars. But at the same time, there are many, as Charlotte Asante was saying, the impact is so ramified and creates both short-term futures we can work on and longer-term futures, maybe some of which we can work on, and some of which show up as bizarre problems. So I'll just end by telling this story, and this goes back to the gender question in terms of impact and how it works out. So from the part of the world that I come from, the Bengal Delta, poor women who still go into rivers to catch riverine small fish actually are now standing in waters waist deep that have become salt because the seawater moving in. So the fish is not only the fish different, they're all getting fungal infections in their reproductive organs, including in the uterus. Some rogue doctors have moved into the area and they're basically doing hysterectomy on these women, just making money. So my feminist friends in Calcutta are trying to lobby the government to bring in a law to regulate hysterectomy. Now, I wouldn't have at all connected ever hysterectomy with climate change. But that's the way it shows up. I was in Kerala where poor women have to go much longer distance to get fresh water with which to cook. It doesn't show up as a political problem. It doesn't register in the voting cycles yet. So what I'm saying is that this crisis, the conversation is non-human, it fragments the future. It creates the non-human in different ways. I mean, there's one way in which you can give rights to rivers, stones, rocks, mountains. What will you do with the microbes? What will you do with the bacteria and the viruses? And the microbial forms of life are the majority forms of life. And they are critical. Humans can go. Humans are dispensable for life to carry on, but these are indispensable features, the so-called inferior forms of life. So that's where I'll end and leave the rest for both Franz and the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. So Franz now knows what he has to do if the rest is left to him. But first, I would like to introduce him to the audience. Franz Maulshagen is Associate Professor in History at Bielefeld University, Affiliate Scholar at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, and Associate Member of the Vienna Anthropocene Network. His main research include environmental history, climate history, the history of disasters, and the history of the early modern period. Recently, his academic work has been emphasizing the study of the Anthropocene and its implications for global history and global environmental history, and he brings now in the expertise of the early modern period, because I think that until now we've talked a lot about what might be called modernity. I'm really struggling with the terms we should use here, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. Lately, Franz Maulshagen has been co-editing several books and actively contributing to various edited volumes. He served, for instance, as a co-editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Climate History, and as well as a co-editor of Climate Change and Cultural Transition in Europe. Both appeared 3 years ago. He also contributed to many books, and I just would like to mention 2 chapters. In English, well, I translate the title into English, The Corona Society, Analysis of the Situation, Perspectives of the Future, and Crisis, Climate, Environmental Conflicts from a Latin American Perspective, both appeared this year. So, Franz Maulshagen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And I can't cover all the rest, of course, since would be asking too much. I think I'll approach the same question of the planetary from a different angle, thereby also touching upon the non-human relation question that Deepesh brought up, though in a more general sense. My strategy here is to reflect on the Paris Agreement and where we stand in the seemingly never-ending negotiations on climate change and how we mitigate and solve that problem. From the point of view of the United Nations, Deepesh already approached that story a little bit from the early post-war, and I approach it from the other direction, going backwards from 2015 with the so-called Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was celebrated as a breakthrough in the locked-in negotiations that followed the Kyoto Protocol and the post-Kyoto process. What we know as post-Kyoto process is actually the idea how to turn the Kyoto Protocol or something of an agreement that would continue the protocol that was scheduled to end in 2012 into something that works in terms of international binding commitments to emission reductions. The concept that failed with the post-Kyoto process and was overcome as the lock-in that blocked everything, I think, was the budgetary approach. But let me just remind everybody what the budgetary approach was between states. It's the idea mostly figured out by scientists, by climate scientists, by earth system scientists, how many reductions each state would have to commit to in order to reach the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, depending on what was to be negotiated in the respective frameworks, targets. And of course, degrees Celsius are calculated in how much CO2 or carbon emissions have to be reduced, so and so many gigatons of carbon. And of course, this is an unequal world. Deepesh has already pointed to the problem of inequality, and the inequality is particularly significant between states if we look at per capita emissions, which are hugely different even today between some of the greatest per capita emitters in the West, to which belong the United States. Per capita emissions, for example, in Australia are even higher, but the number of people is much lower than in the United States. And if you compare that with China, which is the greatest absolute emitter, but still by far not the greatest per capita emitter. So per capita emissions have been something of a standard of measuring inequality in terms of contributions to emissions. And of course, the question of justice was connected with the budgetary approach, as well as historical recognition of responsibilities of early industrial states. Now, the problem why that didn't, the problems or the reasons why that didn't lead to a binding agreement and kind of got locked in are multiple. It's impossible to name them all, and it's not my purpose here. But one of the important reasons for this that I want to mention briefly is simply that some of the states categorized as non-industrial states in the United Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1992, based on an inventory of emissions created in 1990, were China and India and some of the other BRICS states, which in the meantime, in the early 2000s, throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, had actually emerged as industrializing countries by the standards of the primary categorization in the 1990s of first, second, and third world. So That caused a lot of problems, particularly from the point of view of the negotiation ideas that were brought in by the Americans. An equal share of emissions, no inequalities that would be created in global markets if Americans would have to reduce massively, while other major, now then in the early 2000s, already major emitters like China would not have to commit to reductions, etc., etc. And all these points led to this lock-in and actually to the failure of the, in many ways, justice and inequality sensitive approach of the budgetary approach. That failed. What did we get instead, and what was celebrated as overcoming that lock-in? Well, it was the nationally determined contributions. That's the term, the NDCs. Remember that abbreviation, the NDCs, that were actually celebrated as the way out of this lock-in. And actually, yes, politically, it was a success. But what do the NDCs mean? I think Bruno Latour put it in very interesting words as an observer of the 2015 negotiations in Paris. He was present, in Paris at the time. And he was describing somewhere the moment when actually the states handed in spontaneously in the negotiations what they were ready to reduce, how much CO2 or rather carbon emissions they would be ready to reduce. And adding these contributions up, they were far below, of course, what was to be expected. They were far below the amounts calculated by scientists to reach the 1.5 or 2 degrees target defined by the Paris Agreement. So we have an agreement on 1.5 and 2 degrees, but we don't have the contributions that actually match the planetary representation that obviously in the negotiations was only possible to be brought in by scientists, system scientists, climate scientists, to make these calculations. And this mismatch, I think, was what provoked Bruno Latour's wonderful description, saying there was no planetary representation anymore in the politics. And I think this is a powerful illustration of what the category of the planetary illustrates, what the category of the planetary does to discourse here. And it also indirectly reflects the discomfort that a lot of people have with a more traditional label for this political framework in which the United Nations have been operating in since the 1970s, even since the Stockholm Conference in 1972, which is the label of global environmental politics. Global very much represents the idea of the human world in the distinction, the differentiation that was brought in by Deepesh, the human and the non-human. It's also a more established term for all the market instruments, market-oriented and economic-oriented policies that were connected with it, and of course are very much rooted in United Nations post-war traditions, including the developmental policies that came to the agenda of the United Nations following the period of decolonization. But of course, there were many sensitivities involved in the climate negotiations that were related to colonization, decolonization and the post-colonial era. Deepesh has mentioned a few of them. Some of them were historical responsibilities to the making of climate change, anthropogenic climate change, and the inequalities involved with this. And these seem to be gone. So one of the questions that need to be raised, gone in Paris, I have to say, some of the questions that come with these nationally determined contributions is actually, how was it possible to have an agreement on nationally determined contributions with the idea of justice and recognition of historical responsibilities in a way falling over the cliff? I'm particularly interested in that phenomenon. And, the Paris Agreement, not only has it been celebrated for leading the way out of the lock-in that was created in the post-Kyoto process, it has also been celebrated in terms of a new governance regime, which was described in a term introduced 20 years ago by Elinor Ostrom as polycentric governance. The idea is that climate policies are not only executed by states, but also by sub-state institutional, on the sub-state institutional level. For example, communities of city that gather together across nation states, big cities with similar problems threatened, for example, by sea level rise, that come together and negotiate what they can do about this. I think this analysis really is interesting. It is also true. It applies to a lot of the aspects achieved with the climate agreement of Paris, new agents entering the negotiations and creating new fora for negotiating climate policies as well. But I think something that has been missed out in this analysis is actually a more critical perspective on the results, as I was already alluding to, by the mismatch between the nationally determined contributions in the analysis of and views of Bruno Latour, voiced in his views, as well as the question of justice and the colonial and post-colonial sensitivities that were connected with these this question. And I think another way of looking at the Paris Agreement is actually that in many ways it shows the crisis of neoliberalism. To make this final point as clear as I can, let me look once more a little bit further back in the history of climate negotiations, particularly at the transition from the Montreal Protocol, that's 1987, that Deepesh already alluded to, then the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988, and then, of course, the path that led from there to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Remember, this was still the period of early neoliberal governments in the West. It was still the period of Ronald Reagan, a second term, then making the transition to the senior Bush government. And it was also the era of Margaret Thatcher. And I think what actually made these governments even to commit, or even became a crucial element in the making of the IPCC as well as the UNFCCC, was the perspective that they found themselves actually to protect their own economies from market disadvantages of implementing national climate policies, due to the option that they saw of creating internationally binding commitments. That's very interesting. That actually one of the motivations that came from the Montreal Protocol to enter these negotiations on binding commitments for emission reductions, or at least emission reductions at all by the Americans and by other early neoliberal governments, came from kind of mitigating the concerns of threatening their own economies. The interesting thing is that also came with the market models of trying to create markets for CO2 and so on and so forth, a way of negotiating or actually turning the differences in some of the models for these CO2 markets that would emerge into models of negotiating emission rights between industrial countries, traditional industrial nations, and so-called third world countries, for example, which was part of the budgetary ideas. The whole budgetary approach is very much a neoliberal construction if you look at the market models and the market instruments that were available then. So I think if you look at the solution of nationally determined contributions that was found in Paris, most of this was done away with, at least implicitly. And interestingly, I think this also represents and underscores my point, or at least my question, whether or not we should read the outcomes of the Paris Agreement in many ways, or can read them as a crisis or signs of crisis of neoliberalism, neoliberal market instruments, also neoliberal perspectives on the role of the state. Now it is very much focused on sovereign decisions made by state. And this is my final point. I think it is interesting. It says a lot about the current state of politics globally that it was even possible to find a solution based on nationally determined contributions with regard to CO2 or carbon emissions. It says a lot that this idea of keeping the sovereignty in making that concrete decision how much we reduce, how much every state would be ready to reduce, to leave that to the decision of the countries themselves, allowed everybody to make this classical sovereignty argument, as if in a binding agreement, you would give away your sovereignty entirely. So the question is, why was the political atmosphere already back in 2015, prior to Brexit and prior to the appearance of Donald Trump still, so much focusing on this idea of keeping the sovereignty? And it's interesting, I think there was an underlying silent consensus. At least this would be also my question to Deepesh here, if he would share the view that perhaps there was also a consensus, particularly from the point of view of the colonial sensitivities, that the question of sovereignty also allowed them to make an argument to say, okay, leave aside the question of international justice here for the moment. At least we can decide still as sovereign states. I think it's a particular moment in time where that argument worked. And it's a sign actually of the future for me of what happened in 2016 and the following years, where in many ways, particularly on the conservative right in many Western democratic countries, this argument has been strengthened from various points of view. So that's, I think, also finally a sign of the transition we've made from the global to the planetary, although we still have not found the clue of how a world that has been split into many demosses, many people who are organized in the states and other kinds of political units, will make a transition to actually responding to this non-human entity that is the Earth or the climate system. One of the explanations, one of the approaches of explaining why a group of people thinking about climate change, like Deepesh Chakrabarti, like Bruno Latour, like other people, including myself, have felt this discomfort with categories such as the global or world. So I think this is maybe the point to start the discussion. Thanks for the attention. And I have to add an apology that because of my teaching obligations, I was only able to enter this wonderful event at only at 6:15. Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you very much, Franz. This really has been also very thought-provoking. And as I learned from Deepesh that you had that informal dialogue already yesterday, maybe it would be a good idea to really open the discussion to the audience right now. Or Deepesh, would you like to react immediately? So we cannot hear you, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, no, I think you can open it up and these questions will resonate, I'm sure.
So perfect. So now it's the time where you can raise your hands. And in the meantime, I ask a first question. I mean, both of you in a way talked about, as Deepesh would have a one world narrative and its fragmentations and its different fragmentations. And there were different fragmentations on different levels, so to say. So what I really found very intriguing that it is not, if we talk about fragmentations and inequalities, it's not enough to speak about the global south and the global north geographically, because as you pointed out, Deepesh, some of the north live in the south and the other way around. Yes. So, and this makes it very interesting because this is already an understanding of entanglement, that it's not geographically defined what asymmetries mean. But as we learned from Franz about the Paris Agreement, there's another kind of fragmentation because it brings in very strongly the nation state. And I was wondering if it might be interesting to also address the question whether or not the nationally determined contributions also were a sign of difficulties to argue with universals, a point Deepesh made in his statement, because they would have had to refer to somehow global justice issues, and with a suspicion of universals, this might have been very difficult. It's not to replace your argument about the neoliberal theory. It's just the question to both of you if that could be, well, an interesting addition.
Do you want, I think Olaf has a question. Do you want?
Yes, or if you would like to give a short answer, one of you.
Very quickly to respond to Franz, I mean, I agree with him, and my sense was that, at least with the Indian story that I know, because I knew some of the Indian negotiators. So there are two perceptions, and maybe you remember that Obama went to China before Paris deal and got Chinese to agree to sign up to the deal in order to put pressure on India, because once the Chinese agreed, the Indians kind of had to agree. But within India, there were two pressures. One was the idea that the crisis was too big for India to keep insisting on historical responsibility. So they felt they had to give something, the negotiators. But at the same time, so the justice question was folded into the sovereignty question. And by saying nationally determined contributions unmonitored by everybody. So it's not only nationally determined, nobody outside the nation can come and check on it, right? So what they did was, it also basically retained the power structure within the nation state, where actually, see, it's the people who are in petroleum and coal who also see themselves as leading the renewables. And therefore, they make corporate type decisions about when do you begin to, at what pace do you transition? And there, the nation state is a very effective instrument for controlling all of those things. And one of my colleagues did her PhD on the Indian Energy Ministry. And a well-known fact is that most of the bureaucrats are informally promised jobs in the oil and coal sector after retirement. And that's one way in which they control the decisions they make. So basically, the sovereignty framework was the convenient framework within which to fold both the global justice question as well as the international injustice questions.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Deepesh. I mean, I even wonder whether the NDC phrasing itself and the idea of sovereignty is more of a way of publicly selling the agreement. You're absolutely right that the motives and the pressures that were on the Chinese government and the Indian government did not come from the idea of sovereignty and the colonial traditions. But it is a way of sending it to the broader audience. And I think this is linked with the question that Angelika asked about the role of the nation state. I have a suspicion that this is actually disguising the fact that the role of the nation state is not actually renewed in this context. I think it speaks more to nationalism to talk of nationally determined contributions than it speaks to the idea that the nation state will be the place where we find the solutions for the problem. And that's part of what I would call the crisis of neoliberalism here. It's just a representation of the unresolved contradictions that are involved with globalizing economies versus weakening of the state, while at the same time in the national frameworks, still states are members of the United Nations and actors and actually subjects like individuals, and representing something that is really questionable, particularly in the global context. And now we see the mismatch very much in the mismatch between still the now advanced 6 years further. We still see the mismatch between these contributions, these voluntary contributions to emission reductions and what we would actually have to do. Yeah, so that's agreed. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Olaf, just one question to you before you ask your own question. Would it be okay if we had like 10 minutes more?
I think that's fine. We shouldn't interrupt this discussion.
Because, that would really be a pity. So, you are the next one to ask a question, and then I have Werner Gebhardt on my list. And if you do not raise your hands within the next, let's say, 20 seconds, I'll close it.
I have a question on political representation, because as we have said, there's this transition from the global to the planetary, and what does it mean if other non-human actions should have political representation? So we think in, obviously, probably of the experimental theater of Latour, and but does it also mean that, or the question beyond is, who is interpreting these other entities? Is it Western science only? And here we have to take into account, and I think Discourse has shown it, other anthropologists also, that there are very different cosmologies and classification systems, and this means also different types of interacting with the non-human world in a certain way. So probably in the Andean world, a mountain is not considered just a geological formation, but inhabited by an Apu, and you have to address the Apu, the spirit being of this mountain, and so on. So, how can we advance in these forms of political representation? And from subaltern studies, the question: who speaks for this nature subaltern?
Who wants to start?
Okay, I could start. I mean, I have a few thoughts on this question. Again, it's a question that came up in the last session. So, I think, Olaf, you've already yourself said that there's one kind of representation we already are making of these other non-human forms of life and non-life is artistic. So museums have already taken on performance. Museums have taken on certain questions, certain aspects of it. The other kind of representation we talked about before was representation in law, which is different from representation in politics. Now I'm going to focus on representation in politics. And now with many of these creatures, it seems to me that it's the same with Marx's problem that they can't speak for themselves, so they have to be spoken for. But so which means if you appoint spokesperson for these people, let's say experts on mountains or experts on certain category of fish or whatever, the principle of representation then becomes the way in which your doctor represents you or your lawyer represents you, because they have a specialist knowledge of who you are. I'm talking about a modern urban industrialized society. If you do that, and if others are represented more on the usual liberal demographic basis of how you create political constituencies, then one problem that comes up in political theory is that you create permanent minorities in the human political system. And I think somebody raised this question, I forget who, that when we think of representing these people, these other creatures, we still think of having them represented in our vocabulary of representation. And there I think of Adorno's discussion of negative universal history, where he basically says a negative universal history is created when that which is recalcitrant with your universal can represent itself, retaining its intractability in your language of representation. So that the transition problem is made visible. But the other thing I would say is that while diseases have always had human interpretation in all human societies, our knowledge of the microbial world would not have been possible. That is, invisible things would not have been possible before the invention of the microscope and later scientific equipment, right? So in effect, I would say that we have gotten to know about the majority forms of life only from early modernity, whereas diseases have always had cultural interpretation. I'm not denying that. So people have actually interpreted the work of bacteria or viruses culturally without knowing about the existence of entities called viruses. And that's why I think the question of scientific expertise cannot be bypassed if you have an expertise-based representation of these creatures, which you can bypass in an artistic representation.
Yeah, thank you. Franz, would you also like to add something?
As briefly as possible, because I think this is a tricky question and a really, really important question that Olaf just brought up. And my answer is somewhat similar to Deepa's, but focusing merely on the climate system. I think if we take this as an entity or the planetary science that is a system science, it is a scientific construction. And of course, mountains and certainly the climate system cannot speak for themselves, except if we accept, certain phenomena as a way of an expression, say windstorms as an expression of certain mechanisms in the atmosphere that are more often occur more often or become more fierce with climate change, something like that. But I wouldn't dare using language or representation in such a broad sense. So it is a scientific construction, and as it has emerged historically, science does indeed speak in that sense for the Earth system and for the climate system. And it's difficult to see whether there's an alternative, but there are obviously problems involved with this. First of all, you mentioned different cosmologies, first of all. And secondly, the other problem is an epistemological problem in the terms of political epistemology. It's the problem that science never speaks with one voice and that science also evolves. I mean, the knowledge, the truths of today are sometimes the half-truths and falsities of tomorrow. And that also applies to certain aspects of climate science, not the denialist stuff, which is really irrelevant in this context, but really, the modeling advances where really models that were used 10 years ago, climate models, you can't use them anymore, as we don't use the data of the 1960 to 1990 period simply because of the density of the data. We take the most recent data, although they were already biased by climate change. But that has statistical, scientific reasons. But it creates a lot of problems. These scientific habits create a lot of problems for communicating and for creating what I would say a stable representation with regard to the way it's been taken up or is taken up by the public. Yeah.
Of course, this is also a huge topic. Maybe we could discuss that in one of the following series, what you have just mentioned, and the kind of how the legitimization of a opinion differs in scientific communities and in the public, and how it's confused far too often. Yeah. So I have two more questions, and maybe we put them together. Werner Gebhardt, you have the first one, and the second one has Azanafi.
So concerning the question, what about the people to represent nature entities? Children, for example, they can't speak sometimes for themselves. You may have lawyers to make them speak, but they are human beings. So the attribution of having the right to rights is still linked to the idea of the person that is behind. And so we have certainly to enlarge our categories, I think. So that's only a small comment. But for the first wonderful talk, universalization problems, etc. The impression is that globalization is a British story. Mondialisation is a French story, and Weltgesellschaft is a German one. So I got the impression that the planetary perspective might create some kind of new universalism. And do you see any kind of problem in that when we would take also into account that the planet is not the same for everybody? So a culturalist view would always say does not bring the universalism that we were searching and looking for hundreds of years. Perhaps not that. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to combine it with Asa Nafi's question.
Yeah, hello. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, first of all, for these great contributions. And my questions goes a bit like into the like somehow looking in the Paris Agreement as well as into this justice question that was raised, and one like being also at the negotiations in Paris, but rather in a more of the civil society sector and a bit in the drafting. One can say that there was a clear like discussions about interregional conversations. This somehow takes the form that in the politics of climate change in general, you have a really mixed kind of groups of actors. So you have China and the G77. You have the small islands gathered as a group. So you have in comparison to other politics, kind of different political formations, and you see here like a mixture of maybe the north and the south, somehow like in a way funny way, sometimes I would say, but still, like when one talks about the politics on the ground of how things then eventually takes place, you see a strong division of the G7 and G20 taking major role in the drafting and then like leading the role there, leading the end decision. So creating actually the final draft that was somehow being done behind closed doors. But for me, like this somehow shows slightly how like in terms of coalitions, in terms of political conversations, this interregional conversation was ongoing, was let's say full of life. But then when it came into the actual politics, this somehow was again super hierarchical, following normal politics, let's say, and yeah, like again brings the question of to what extent are the institutions of the UN institutions are capable into somehow discussing these or like tackling these let's say global or planetary issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we now have the last round, and please Deepesh and please Franz, could you try to answer these two last questions and yeah, use the chance to give your last comment. So maybe Deepesh, you would like to start.
Maybe Franz goes first this time, and I have the final word.
Okay, perfect.
No, whatever.
Yeah, well, I can try, but I'll only respond to the second question, Basser, on the mismatch between the power relations of the big powers and the way. I mean, these climate conferences. Paris is just one of the biannual conferences, or now they're even annual conferences, where everybody is aboard, different kinds of groups and representation. I think it shows. I think the climate conferences themselves show where we stand with polycentricity. A lot of NDCs, a lot of non-governmental NGOs are involved in this in these negotiations nowadays. That was different 30 years ago. So the state focus has shifted within these negotiations, although the framework is still the UNFCCC. But there's a mismatch between the way this has been organized or reorganized over time and the decision-making process that in the end still depends on the superpowers, and those are the super emitters, in a certain way. And I think there's no way out of this dilemma except a slow motion in terms of finding new fora and bringing polycentricity, which I think really is an interesting way of describing the situation, to the fore, and create decision making also on the sub-state level, where not necessarily governmental representatives are finally making the decisions. I have no other solution to propose here. But it's interesting what you mentioned, Asa. I mean, it is obvious in these negotiations that there's this kind of mismatch. That's what it is. Yeah.
Okay, just to add to what Franz was saying, first of all, to Warner's question, I think, yes, like the Anthropocene, the planet has already become a polysemic word. And people sometimes use this word, but in different senses. I mean, I was in an argument with a young philosopher in America, going hammer and tongs until I realized, or he realized, both realized, that for him, planet meant kind of a geological history of the Earth read through a fusion of thermodynamics and Bataille. So his expenditure category, basically he converted entropy into a Bataillean notion of expenditure, and he was reading it that way. And I meant Earth system, right? So I find that being a humanities person and a humanist, I always have to do with this polysemy of words. And this happened with the word. Any word that becomes popular acquires many meanings and gets difficult to discuss, but for that reason. So one has to be careful. And going back to Asser's remarks, I just want to say that the Western countries, and America in particular, but the Western countries have greater institutional capacity to come to these negotiations with drafts already written up. They do so my Indian friends who are delegates to the climate always say we are amazed by how prepared the Americans are. But that's because, the more people, there are more just the institutional capacity is deep, and there are more specialists. The more people who are thinking about the general problem. I ask, why don't Indian and Chinese scientists write about the climate problem as a general problem for everybody? They don't. The West has the capacity to produce these people. And that speaks to a historical inequality again, that the Western institutions have been there and have survived for a long time, while Asia is still trying to build one of the top 10 universities in the world. And the Chinese and Koreans and the Singaporeans may get there first, but it's still an effort. And that reflects itself in these negotiations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deepesh Chakrabarti and Franz Maulsagen. I think this really was a very intriguing dialogue, and thank you for allowing us to listen to you. And if I'm already thanking, so I also would like to thank again the Ministry of Education and Research and the DLR, of course, and the team from Interpreting Columbia for the technical support, as well as Tara Stranin and Alexandra Young for the translation. This is very important. Thank you so much. And of course, I would like to thank again Olaf Kaltmeier for making that happen, and also his whole team of the CALAS, Nadine, Jakob, and all the others who worked behind the scenes. And yeah, thank you so much. I've learned a lot today, so I'm really, really thankful that you made that happen. And I also would like to invite you to the next conference of this series dealing with social inequalities and political exclusion. It takes place on the 2nd of November at 4 o'clock Central European time. And it would be a pleasure and very interesting to meet you, all of you again. Have a nice evening, and thanks again to everybody.
Thank you, and stay well, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.